Nativity and nationality cognate thinking is the order of the day. Now, let us share with you some liberating and knowledgeable principles about American law and the laws of government. And so now we're going to go into some of these fundamentals that I will share with you, that I've been sharing with people for about 40 years, etc. And this particular, I want to present to you to know that people who claim to be government, who claim to have authority over you, who have been taxing you wrongfully, and who have been executing powers over your property, over your bodies, over your labors, etc. If what you have been experiencing is contrary to what I'm about to read to you, know that you've been dealing with criminals and frauds. That's the beginning of many of you to be on your path of social, political, and economic liberation, sometimes referred to as self-determination. Isn't that term being used lightly and wrongly by many who don't teach these things? And you'll also recognize why they don't teach civics. Now, I'm going to give you some categories that are being presented here. However, we will not go over all of them. We will go over some of them points for points that will give you something to mull over, to think about, to conceptually recognize that you have not been exposed to this, although they've been telling you that they are your government. Pardon me. You'll be dealing with laws in general. Pardon me. Laws in general. Justice. Laws. Law of nature. Law of nations. Municipal law. Sovereignty. What is sovereignty? By whom sovereignty is exercised. Division of the powers of sovereignty. What is a constitution? And different forms of government as an example. And so what I'm going to read to you, just to get you primed in relationship to what the intent of the matter that we're presenting to you for your liberation purposes, and for you to start taking more responsibility in your lives, presenting to you, and this is in enumerated form, say points from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And I think that should be sufficient for the night, since we can't go any further, but it will be enough, I think, for you to get the concepts or ideas of what we're sharing with you tonight here at the House of Reawakening Minds, which is being moderated by Dr. Naila Gilliam, and I'm sure that many of you have shared with her, also have walked with her in the official office hours of Dr. G for quite some time. And I think this will be helpful for us all in the constant communications and questions that arise from the people who have been sharing these nights and these evenings with us. This is to help you along the way, also to help you formulate your questions more intelligently relative to substance as opposed to emotionalism, which has been, for the most time, with many of us, a waste of time and actually dragging, or what you call retarding. So we want to counter that kind of mentality, those kind of activities, by giving you factual information. So here we go. Institutes of American Law, preliminary book of laws and government. And I'm going to go from chapter 1, and I'm going to deal from, say, 1 to 10 points. Keep in mind, take notes. And many of you who have always been sharing here with us, the House of Reawakening Minds, remember to go and review the video so that you can take more refined notes. And we will be sharing some of this information in printed form with those who come to share with us in the post that Dr. Naila will be posting in the near future. And that will be listed That would be listed as for the people.
Up close and personal, 2.
Yes, number 2. All right. So those of you who make the trek to come to the up and personal with us too,
on the 30th,
this will be made available for those who want to purchase it just for printing costs. No more than printing costs. So here we go. Pay attention. Take notes. Number 1. Man is a social being, fond of the company of his fellows, and always disposed to live with others. It is thus that families, tribes, and nations are formed. Men render to and receive mutual benefits and assistance from each other. But in such societies, there must constantly arise causes of difference among the several members. And these must be adjusted or settled either by the parties themselves or by some power which is superior to them. Their rights must also be regulated so that the parties may know to what each one is entitled. This is done by an actual or presumed agreement of all the members of the society, the state, or the nation, by the establishment of certain rules which acquire the name of laws. The knowledge of these laws, or the science by which they are understood, overstood, understood, comprehended, is called jurisprudence. 2. The first step to understand the science is therefore to know exactly the nature of the laws and to form of them a definite and precise idea. By science is understood a connection of truths founded on evident principles or on demonstrations. A collection of truths of the same kind arranged in a methodical order for the purpose of making them more easily comprehended and understood. 3. In its most extensive sense, the word law signifies rule of action. It is a rule which all beings, whether animate or inanimate, reasonable or not, must observe. Thus we say the laws of motion, the laws of gravitation, the laws of mechanics, as we say natural laws, political or criminal laws. In this sense, all beings have their laws. The material world have their laws. Animals and man each have their laws. The knowledge of all these laws belong to philosophy, which is the immensity, embraces all the knowledge which man acquire by the use of his reason. More circumscribed in its object, jurisprudence regulates only human actions. 4. Law in this view, then, is the rule of human actions. That is, of those actions which are the result of the free exercise of intelligence and of will. Law is called a rule of action by a metaphor borrowed from mechanics. A rule, in its proper sense, is the instrument by which, or by means of which, we draw from one point to another the shortest line possible, which is called a straight line. The rule is used in comparison to the arts in order to judge whether a line is straight, as it is used in law to judge whether an action is just or unjust. An action is just or right when it conforms to the rule, which is the law. It is unjust when it differs from the line or the rule, then it is not right. And so it is of our will or intention. 5. Justice has been variously defined, and it is the constant and perpetual disposition to render to every man his due. Or perhaps more correctly, it is a conformity of our actions and wills to the law. 6. Justice is an interior or exterior. First is the conformity of our will, and the last of our actions to the law. The union of both makes perfect justice. The last is alone the subject of human jurisprudence. Interior justice is the object of morality. 7. In the most extensive sense of the word, justice differs but little from virtue, for it includes within itself the whole circle of virtues. Yet the common distinction between them is this: that which positively and in itself is called virtue, when considered relatively with respect to others, has the name of justice. But justice, being in itself a part of virtue, is confined to things simply good or evil, and consists in a man taking such proportion of them as he ought. 8. To make a law, there must be a superior who has authority to make it, as an inferior who is bound by it. To complete the definition of law, we must say that it is a rule prescribed by a lawful superior. God, as a principle, is the first great superior. Peace and order in society would not be guaranteed by the principles of human legislation if those principles were not protected by the salutary influence of true religion. Now, of course, that's distinguished from dogma. And human laws would be insufficient to regulate the conduct of man if their action was not supported, directed, and supplied by religion and morality, and religion would of themselves be powerless to ensure the peace of society without the aid of the civil law. Many moral obligations exist which are not enforced by the civil law, and these are left to the operations of conscience, and such, for example, as gratitude and benevolence. 9. The law of nature, or natural law, is that which God, the sovereign of the universe, has prescribed to all men, not by any formal promulgation, but by the dictate of right reason alone. It is ascertained by a just consideration of the agreeableness of disagreeableness of human actions to the nature of man, and it comprehends all the duties we owe either to the Supreme Being, emphasized, to ourselves, emphasized, or to our neighbors, as reverence to God's self-defense, temperance, honor to our parents, benevolence to all, a strict adherence to our engagements, gratitude, and the like. By natural law is also understood the system of collection of those laws arranged together in a methodical order. And the law of nature is superior in obligation to any other. It is binding in all countries and at all times. And no human laws are valid if opposed to this, and all which are binding derive their authority either directly or indirectly from it. 10. The law of nations is a system of rules deducible by human reason from the immutable principles of natural justice and established by universal consent among the civilized nations of the earth in order to decide all disputes and to ensure the observance of good faith and justice in the intercourse which must frequently occur between them, or it depends upon mutual compacts, treaties, leagues, and agreements between separate, free, and independent communities. The law of nations, jus gentium, has of late years been called international law. So when you hear international law, keep in mind the laws of nations, etc., they are conjoined. So nations with regard to each other are considered as individuals, and the law of nations is to regulate the differences which may exist between them in their national capacity. And of course, that would be in what is known as diversity of citizenship or diversity of nationality, i.e., those would be consular venues, and such courts would be largely consular in their nature. Now, they are in a state of nature and must be considered as so many free and independent persons living in that state, and therefore the rules of natural law are to be applied to them. International law is generally divided into two branches: the natural law of nations, consisting of rules of justice applicable to the conduct of states; the positive law of nations, which consists of the voluntary law of nations, derived from the presumed consent of nations, arising out of their general usage; the conventional law of nations, derived from the express consent of the nations as individuals and evidenced in treaties and other international contracts or compacts; the customary law of nations, which is a tacit consent to certain rules which have been observed by them. The law of nations has been divided by writers into necessary or voluntary, or in absolute and arbitrary, by others into primary and secondary, which later has been subdivided into customary and conventional. Another division is made into natural and positive. The various source and evidence of the law of nations are the following: the rules of conduct deducible by reason from the nature of society existing among independent states, which ought to be observed among nations; the adjudications of international tribunals such as prize courts and boards of arbitration; text writers of authority; ordinance or laws of particular states prescribing rules of conduct of their commissioned cruisers and prize tribunals; the history of wars, negotiations, treaties of peace, and other matters relating to the intercourse of nations; treaties of peace, alliance, and commerce, declaring, modifying, and defining the pre-existing international law. That's 11. All right. That should be sufficient at this point. So I want to put you in the state of mind that the fundamental principles of law are based actually in common divine reasoning. If a law or an ens legis execution And an ens legis is where you have people who claim to be in legislative government or sometimes wrongfully executing from the bench, where you see people who claim to be judges are making up rules that are contrary to the established law. Those are frauds, etc. And anything that contradicts common sense is not the common law, and 90% of the time is not the law. This is why these fundamentals are being shared with you, so that you can have a fundamental concept of basic principled law, which harmonizes with common sense. If it contradicts common sense, 90% of the time, it's not the law. So let's talk.
I do have a question, though, if you don't mind.
Yeah, come on, let's talk.
You talked about who created or established the law of nations that you speak of in the text.
Basically, the laws of nations is ancient, coming from the ancient Moabites, Canaanites, which you'll find, and also the structures of what is known as the ancient and modern principles of jurisprudence was formulated in Asia and Africa, and was promoted for the world, or coming out through trade, etc., through Iberia. And so the word Iber or Uber means the highest or the noblest. So when you hear the word Iber or Uber, it comes from ancient Iberia, or the ancient central point of the Picts, the Moorish, and the Dubs. And you are known them now as the original Aboriginal Europeans.
That's interesting. Uber.
So usually you will say, they will teach, when they're teaching law or principles of law, they will say the principles of jurisprudence coming from England, without qualifying that it's Uber, Iberia, yes, i.e. Moors. They're the founders of the principles of civilization. And so when you're dealing with jurisprudence is a science that treats of positive law based in nature's law and nature's God, comes from ancient Africa, and has been spread around the world among nations, and manifests itself today as ancient and modern jurisprudence. And the nature of this is found in the principles of treaties and constitutions aligned with nature's law and common sense and fairness, and the nature of the higher self, distinguished from principles of lower self.
I got it. All right. But the law itself that you're reading from is that being used in what government?
All right, this is basically American law. So when you talk American law, it's important for you to know who the Americans are, which is also why I read that earlier, because people keep assuming that Americans are the hybrid Europeans that have been occupying North America for the last couple hundred years. The principles of constitutional order has no origin with them. It has origin with the Africans, i.e. loosely referred to as the Phoenicians.
I guess I have to ask the question, and some might say, if we had established laws and all these tenets, and if things come from our laws, how did we get out from under our own established laws? Ignorance,
and you've been constantly. Now this goes back to also what I presented earlier. Those of you who have been sharing with us here at the House of Reawakening Minds, you're reminded in satisfaction to your question to go quickly into your phone or into your computer and look up the philosophy page of the General Education Board, and that will tell you much right there. Because most of our people have been so-called educated by members of the Board of Education, whether they've been the hybrid Europeans or people who have been participating with them, who are among our own. And they have been actually participants and proponents of actually the mind control systems and the animal husbandry that our people are suffering from in the name of education, and thus also with us violating our ancient principles and also from being conquered, have lost context with the consciousness of our true Sabian culture, and therefore we have fallen away from the principles of government and thus become subject to occupational powers of the conquerors under the Spanish Inquisition, known as the unum sanctum operations of the popes of Rome, who took over Roma. So when you do research, you'll know the distinction between Roma, Africa, and Rome, the hybrid Europeans. This is why I also reference to many of you, if you would like to have a better comprehension of the nature of modern political operations, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, do some research in the Napoleonic Wars, and then make some reference to when the hybrid Europeans took over the African popes and rulers of the ancient world and reconstructed the history which you have been receiving. And all of this conjoined has much to do as to how we fell away or lost knowledge of true culture. It's not hard to find. But particularly, again, while we're talking about this, is to, with the intention of mentally liberating or helping to liberate many of our people from the parasites who are closest to us. See, because like like they say, you can't get at the big octopus. What you can do is start reducing the tentacles that are wrapped around you. And that is these fakers, parasitic people around you who have came into the Moorish movement for the sole purpose of making a revenue stream for themselves, not for really liberating our people. Get rid of them first, and then you can get to the head of the octopus. And it will be done spiritually and with consciousness. So once you have a comprehension of what should be, you absolutely know what shouldn't be. And also this is relative to over the years, you recognize some people just appear not to get or to be able to cognate and to wrap their heads around that which is de facto distinguished from that which is de jure. While we've had these conversations for years, you'll see some of the questions that arise among the people is that concept is not clear with them, which is again why we're having this short treatise tonight on the matters of American law, that they have contributed actually to the occupational hybrid Europeans. You must know it actually came from your forefathers. It was adopted by them so that they could have structured government, but those principles did not originate with the hybrid Europeans. They originated with the Moors. So don't reject them, as some people have been telling you. Oh, those constitutional principles don't apply to you. Those allodial principles don't apply to you. Yes, they absolutely do.
His question. Take the question. This question says, can any of our, I'm not sure what it is. Can any of our Moorish sovereign power protect us from the V mandate the de facto has in place?
Yes. Well, this is back to, as many of you know who have shared years ago with us with the roundtable, and also who've been sharing with us on the House of Reawakening Minds, one of the methodologies that I've been using over the years that has angered many people among our own as well as the hybrid Europeans is I've been doing or presenting writs and concepts with our people that actually are directed to the people reclaiming their divine self or their divine sovereign right. In doing so, they are actually psychologically firing the so-called public servants. i.e., or making them irrelevant. In the process, it has made them respond or force their hand to start openly suppressing the people, and by virtue of that, exposing themselves. And then by virtue of the people recognizing that these people are not their government and have not been actually serving them, but actually been serving themselves at the expense of the people and to the injury of the people, that state of mind is necessary for our people to willingly render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, or give back to Rome the false concepts that Rome has promoted and the fakery that they have been operating under, pretending to be your government, and to turn back to those principles of your ancient mothers and fathers of jurisprudence. And in doing so, you will be empowered, going back to your quote unquote God self, and therefore they would have no power over you. And so they recognize that that this is really the chess move I was making on a fifth dimensional plane, which is why many of them don't like me.